further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Valerie Small. So Dr. Small is a first generation student to graduate from college in her family, just like me. And she also earned her PhD from Colorado State University in 2013. Her research is super interdisciplinary, and her PhD work was conducted on the homelands of the Crow tribe of Indians, Crow Nation, and home of her maternal grandfather. Her research was focused on trees, water, and the Crow people, and incorporated Western science within a traditional knowledge framework. This research was published in the 4th National Climate Assessment as a case study on the Northern Great Plains. Dr. Small joined Trees, Water, and People in April 2019 as the new National Director for Tribal Programs, and she's also an affiliate professor at CSU. Trees, Water, and People and Valerie believe that tribes should set their own conservation priorities and manage their own conservation projects. Thus, at TWP and their national program partners, they partner with Indigenous-based nonprofits and grassroots organizations so that Indigenous communities can create local and sustainable job opportunities to mitigate the impacts of extreme weather events like flooding and drought and wildfire, and monitor restoration and reforestation efforts due to warming climate. I'm really looking forward to the seminar, and just a few housekeeping things. If you have anything you want to add in the chat, like maybe where you're joining us from, since we're all dispersed all over the country, that'll be great. I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado right now. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll have a short Q&A session at the end. Yeah, so without any further ado, I'll introduce Valerie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bella. I appreciate that. And it's so good to meet a fellow CSU alumni. Today, I'm just going to talk with you about sort of the role of nonprofits that they can play, as well as land-grant universities, or the academy, as I put it, to empower tribal sovereignty. And we do this through culture, ecology, and food systems. And that is, in essence, how we approach working in climate justice for these underserved communities. And I also want to say, Kahe de Ichluk, Bikbiam Epsalaka, Bilukshe, and Hena Babe, Ichibachachik. So today is a good day, and I am Epsalaka Crow from the Crow Nation in South Central Montana. So I will be moving my slides, I think. And it's not moving. There we go. For some reason, there we go. Before I begin, I always start with our land acknowledgement.
Make sure you understand the importance of emphasizing the relationship between people and land. That Native people recognize that everything has a spirit: plants, animals, insects, mountains, and water. Native American identity is deeply tied to these, and they are referenced and respected in our culture, our creation stories, healing ceremonies, and celebrations. Please keep this in mind as I share the land acknowledgement with you. So we acknowledge and respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know why I continue to have that problem. Thank you for your patience. So I want to talk to you about who we are and what we do and why we do what we do, and then get into some discussions about the way in which we do the types of projects, and then also discuss with you the role that universities can also play in working with tribal communities. Um, so our TWP national team is Sebastian Africano. He is our executive director. James Calabasa is Kiwa from Santo Domingo Pueblo, and he's our manager. And Emily Sports just was brought on. She's our national program coordinator and has worked with the people in Arizona, and also worked in British Columbia with Indigenous peoples up there. We also have Jose Chalit, who is Latinx and from Mexico, and Sammy Louth, our great grants manager, who we couldn't do without. So let's talk about some of our core tenets of what we do. We believe that natural resources are really best protected when the local people actually play an active role in their care and management. And preserving the local ecosystem is really essential, particularly on tribal lands, which are extremely degraded and are disproportionately impacted from climate change for the social, economic, and environmental well-being of these Indigenous communities. So our mission really is to support these community-led regenerative natural resource projects that will improve the economies and social and cultural lifeways of Indigenous peoples within the US. So when I came on board in 2019, we essentially worked with Henry Red Cloud, who we have been working with since 2005 with solar energy projects, and began in 2015 working on restoration project on Oglala Sioux tribal land because of a fire that had gone through and essentially wiped out their ponderosa pine population to the point where it couldn't regenerate. So we started working there and started planting ponderosa pines in 2015. I came on board in 2019, and here is how I indigenized the national program. So we start by saying that essentially our tribal engagement process is really to support tribal sovereignty in all ways and and embracing the sacredness in all things, and working with people through a really Indigenous planning process. And as you can see, these Indigenous decision-making processes sort of work through a circular way, much like ecology, which is anything taken out of the system is going to disrupt that system. So the Indigenous people's knowledge is really through the tribal communities. That knowledge circulates and is traditional and contemporary knowledges that inform these Indigenous worldviews and beliefs and values, which are much different than the Western thought process, particularly on economies and values. And so these feed into these Indigenous decision-making processes. What we do through our Indigenous planning process is, if you look on the left, we look at pro-Indigenous, which is really for Indigenous peoples. We don't do that. Para-Indigenous is sort of with Indigenous people, and we do only that tangentially, because what we're working towards is really building capacity so that all things are done by the Indigenous peoples themselves. So if you look at how nonprofits work and how there's sort of a continuum, if you will, is you identify these community needs, but really the needs of the community are determined by the community itself. We partner with local and they partner with local NGOs, build these partnerships, design and implement projects, and then evaluate and monitor. We do it a bit differently. We kind of come into this towards the empowerment. If you look on the continuum from the left to the right, we don't inform, consult, involve, or collaborate. We sort of come into that to be able to sort of work as a facilitator, to convene really the funding that is lacking for a lot of the implementation of on-the-ground projects for risk management, particularly natural resource restoration projects at landscape scales, and come into basically then identify partners that will allow capacity building for the tribal community itself to enact and become part of that project. So our tribal and community engagement model is kind of what we have, defined this to be, is really, it helps to have the community involved at the beginning, and then focus that on long-term health and well-being, really being tied to the natural resources. Long-term commitment is something else that we firmly believe sort of separates us from other nonprofits. And then we also try to engage partnerships that will share the same values of community design led and implemented projects. And we all really try to support those local Indigenous and community-based nonprofits, grassroots people and small farmers and ranchers, small producers who are looking to try to serve as models, if you will, by putting up small greenhouses and growing their own foods to basically develop markets, products for market. Human dimensions capacity building is really where we focus. So we're not infrastructure per se, because we work with trying to build tribal forest ecosystems through ecology and traditional food system based lenses. We do often work on bird scar sites, particularly because in the Southwest where we work now, a lot now in the Tri Pueblo Coalition, we'll discuss in a few minutes, is essentially climate-driven drought and prolonged drought and a disturbance of the monsoon seasons is having havoc on forest ecosystems. And then renewable energy education is something we also focus on for tribal community and middle-aged school kids. And it's called SWEAT. I donned it, SWEAT. It really stands for Solar Warrior Empowerment Training. And we were bringing that now into a virtual format because of COVID. Rangeland restoration projects for tribes, sort of what we do is it's planning, but you can plan until the sun goes down and you're not going to accomplish anything to help build resilient community. And we try to look at this from a landscape scale projects because, as you know, just because the exterior boundary ends at a certain point doesn't necessarily mean that what's going on in the valleys and in the uplands is going to prevent any impact from having havoc on tribal communities. So why do we do this work? Well, what we want to try to do is empower tribal community to sort of heal traditional ancestral lands that have been degraded over time and affected by environmental impacts, natural disasters. If you look at Dene and Navajo, they've been, devastated by the Gold King mine spill, for instance, and I'll talk about Dr. Carletta Chief's work later on. Promote Indigenous land stewardship approaches for regenerating and sustaining their precious natural resources so they can pass those on to future generations. It's tied to language and it's tied to history of place. So it's all tied together within their cultural identity. And to facilitate transmission of that traditional knowledge, we try to bring together in our planting projects, in any of our projects, the youth and elders, so we can conserve and protect those cultural lifeways for the generations that are yet to come. So what I like to talk about is there is a difference between regenerative versus sustainability. We really don't want to sustain current systems because they're degraded. So what we talk about is regenerative versus sustainability. Resiliency versus climate change, because climate change for tribal people is not always a very clear subject matter. And in cases where, like on the Crow tribe, who are dependent upon for their funds to run the tribe, tribal businesses, et cetera, on oil and gas, and are struggling to try to find how to engage in renewable energy and move forward to essentially diversify their energy needs, have a very hard time with discussing climate change. So we sort of approach it from a resilient community-based approach to value-added actions. Reciprocity is always key anytime that you're dealing with tribes versus a transaction. and decision-making, sort of shifting all of that from the internal to external for tribal needs driven, to recognize and reflect and value systems that are non-capitalist economies. These are self-determining nations, empowering these communities through capacity building and building technical assistance capacity as well. So we try to indigenize our knowledges, enact these through honoring the knowledge of ceremony and cultural protocol prior to any planting projects. We involve Indigenous knowledge practitioners, youth and elders to build these partnerships so that they can serve as advisories in governing committees, and involving Indigenous knowledge practitioners to develop these monitoring protocols once these trees are in the ground, inviting community elders who have a longer perspective about observing change to sort of teach other community members about what they're witnessing and consult those oral histories so that we can save those knowledges and enact those on the ground. And try to talk about social environmental change through these actions that are on the ground, sort of nation building from working within restoration projects and food system regenerative projects. So we begin and end aspects of any of these partnerships, any workshops we have with ceremony to situate the workplace in a specific place to acknowledge the spiritual forms of knowledge in these partnerships. And preserving Indigenous languages are always key so that they can learn how to recognize plants and places within their own language and their own cultural histories. So national program projects, currently what we're doing is working on a community-based model to address reforestation projects. Landscape scale restoration projects at watershed scales are important in preservation of culture and land. And most importantly, these are tied to food security to promote reconnecting these cultural-based foods, because believe it or not, tribes are very colonized and they eat at McDonald's as well and don't have healthy diets. A lot of it driven from assimilation policies that have not benefited the tribes, and so that peoples can bring forth these healthy and traditional foods. And renewable energy to educate our youth, tribal youth, so that they begin to understand that they're important in leading the future of these tribes towards diversifying and adding renewable energy to reduce their fossil fuel usage. Some of our partners and tribes include the Red Cloud Renewable on Pine Ridge, the Tribe Pueblo Coalition, consisting of the Jemez, Santa Dominga Kiwa, and also the Cochiti. These are neighboring pueblos where we've started to work with the Santo Domingo in 2019. It sort of developed into a Tribe Pueblo Coalition, which we're so excited about. That was sort of driven by Cynthia Naha, who is Hopi and runs their natural resource department in Santo Domingo, New Mexico. We work with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe currently on a project that focuses on the Mancos River Project restoration, riparian restoration. And the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico, CSU State Forest Nursery is where we gather most of our seedlings that are grown throughout the summer or the late winter and fall previously, and then we deliver those during the planting season. And we're in fact right in the field today in Pine Ridge planting 13,000 ponderosa pines, and we've diversified since I came on board species to include food sovereignty species such as chokecherry, buffalo berry, and wild plum, as well as the cottonwood tree, which is a very sacred ceremonial tree. East Jemez Landscape Futures, we started working with them in New Mexico because they are working from a multi-actor, multi-environmental agency approach towards, approaching their extreme fire that happened, the Los Conchas fire recently in 2011, and the prolonged drought system. Watershed group that focuses on those, and working from a tribal perspective within that group has also been beneficial. We also work with the National Indian Youth Leadership Project. I encourage you to look them up. They are run by Mac Hall for about 25 years, work mostly in New Mexico and Arizona and in Pine Ridge. but essentially we incorporate within the Solar Warrior Empowerment Training their pro-social emotional behavior component into the curriculum, because what we want to try to do is build leadership skills, build self-esteem, reduce and empower them to believe that they have a future and that they are important in the community. The Santa Fe Indian School, we also work with a lot with our Solar Warrior Empowerment, and also they do a lot of work with the Forest Restoration Project. So we gift them trees every year for Kaiti Blue Sky, who is one of our great supporters there, who teaches their ecology program and also has a greenhouse where he can work with the students in planting trees within many tribal Pueblo communities that students go to school there for and represent, and can take those seedlings back and plant them on their own lands. One of our other great partners is Chanwick Monkey, Rebel Earth Farms in Martin, South Dakota, that if you can see in the bottom right there, that they have actually 4 of these Quonsets or hoop houses, and are in the process of building out pole barn to process foods. They deliver a lot of foods to the community members throughout Pine Ridge Reservation. And so we are working with them and partnering with them to help build their local farm system. And this is Patricia Hammond, who is the woman that is a visionary and who has really grown this from just her own vision and working with South Dakota State Extension Office in getting funding. And now we work with them on getting funding to try to help continue to build out their farming system. So what did we do when COVID-19 hit? We're a community-based kind of nonprofit where we prefer to go in and work with communities. We had to sort of shift gears and try to figure out how we could best support our partners and our community members within these tribal communities. So one of the things we really focused on was the fact that because of the lockdowns on reservations and COVID virus really hit disproportionately Indigenous peoples. I lost myself 5 family members in December. And so one of the things that was difficult was during the lockdown was getting out and getting access to food, water, because in many cases on reservations, their water quality is poor. So they have to, bring in water, haul water, and particularly medicines that they utilize. For instance, Pine Ridge grows a lot of traditional teas. Other funding through a public campaign for both our international and national programs, so that we could send funds directly to Chanwick Monkey, Rebel Earth Farms, and they could go to Rapid City and collect food in bulk and then put those in packages and deliver it within the reservation to these vulnerable populations or families within that reservation, particularly elderly, a group home with youth, and those who were disabled who couldn't get out at all. So we provided about $10,000 and fed about 500 people in 6 weeks' time, as well as in McKinley County through the National Indian Leadership Project, which is highly Dene populated Navajo Nation population in New Mexico through the National Indian Youth Leadership Project, and funds also sent to provide emergency water and medicine relief to the Epsalica elders in Crow Agency, Montana. The other thing we did was we shifted to providing a 5-week webinar series. What I wanted to do was try to focus on food systems and essentially empowering tribal culture, ecology, and food systems, partnering with Dr. Jeremy Pinto, who also runs the Intertribal Nursery Council out of Moscow, Idaho. And he is basically the leader in that area, and we wanted him to be a speaker, but then he actually partnered with us, and we were so pleased, and we were so honored to get Chef Sean Sherman, who actually is out of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and is getting ready. I don't know if you want to look him up, but he's getting ready to open this fantastic Indigenous-based restaurant, a true visionary, and he grew up on Pine Ridge and is basically wrote a fantastic cookbook that talks about how to, take out the flowers and the sugars and all of the preservatives from just going out and selecting more natural species. And so he won the James Beard Award and was our featured speaker to kick off our webinar series. We also wanted to talk about seed relatives, the collection and storage techniques, about seed saving, so that they could grow their own species, to do their own restoration projects and save their own traditional food sources and grow their own essentially. And talked a bit about in the next one on agroforestry, both from a U.S. tribal perspective and as well as our international program talked about it from their communities within Guatemala, Utzche, and Coeus in Honduras. Utzche is from Guatemala, and talking about how it is very different. These are all recorded, and I encourage you, if you're interested and have the time, to access through the website below, where it was hosted through the Western Forestry Conservation Association. You'll see that there's a marked difference. In the U.S. tribal land sort of focused on looking at production and little neat rows, whereas in Guatemala and Honduras, they look at agroforestry from a very different perspective, and it is really from a nutritional plate perspective. So I encourage you to look at that, and also building circular economies and doing a lot of trading of different plant species from different Mayan communities. And we also did one for the challenges of tribal greenhouse management. It's a big lift for tribes to do this, and we wanted Jeremy, who is the expert, to talk. Great talk from him. We also did this with Native Seed and Grassland Restoration Project. Christina Eisenberg, Dr. Eisenberg, did a great talk on their restoration program they conducted, and will do again this year on the Fort Belknap Reservation for rangeland and grassland restoration. So why we did this was to support these Indigenous communities, which was just exasperated, these food insecurities exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, so that they could start reducing their food insecurities, increase their economic opportunities, improve access to healthy foods, because most of these are located in rural reservation areas where they don't have access to healthy foods, to go back more to a traditionally harvested food sources, and also to save those species used for ceremony. We had 850 people attend from 14 different countries and multiple tribes throughout the United States. So we felt we really had a large reach, and were able to identify from our surveys our next webinar series, which we want to provide, which is more of a technical, on the ground, videography of how to do these things. So our current projects, really, if you see on the right, that's from Rebel Earth Farms, Tri Pueblo Coalition in New Mexico, working with the Santo Domingo Jemez and Cochiti, and the Santa Fe Indian School, continuing to work with them through our Solar Warrior Empowerment. And also they'll be engaging with us on planting trees again this fall, just shortly before the monsoon season in August. Rebel Earth Farms, we're continuing to help them get their pole barn built. And so they can employ other people to work in processing foods and getting those ready for pop-up markets. We also continue to work with Red Cloud Renewables on Pine Ridge, where we are currently at planting a lot of trees. And we're continuing to work with Ute Mountain Ute Tribe in Colorado, as well as others. And if you look at the bottom right, what you're looking at is what's called a farm in a box. And it's essentially a solar-based system that will allow them to connect that to a water source that's pumped to be able to water these vegetables and trees. They're planning on having us come in and bring in trees to grow for sort of a fruit orchard, and also for windbreaks, because They've been impacted by some tornadoes that have ripped off those Quonset, those hoop houses that you've seen earlier. And continuing our journey, we want to respect for landscape scale projects. So the role of land grant universities and the academy. Research with a purpose. Reciprocity is really key. Tribes drive the priority areas for conservation. That's important to remember, rather than a student or thinking that you have the right idea about what you want to save. You need to listen to what is important to them. To provide important ecological research helps, but you have to remember that that's not going to drive the actual research process, because it needs to be couched and situated within Indigenous knowledge frameworks. So that is how essentially I did my research on the Crow Reservation, was essentially letting the Indigenous knowledge guide the projects, but then you can come back and do plots and that kind of thing. CSU Human Dimensions of Natural Resources they were grad students who I worked with in the fall of 2019, and they were really helpful in basically doing a 1-semester research project, group project, where they helped identify species-specific research that I didn't have time to do, particularly in looking at ponderosa pine and the anticipated climate change, climate-driven upland, forest species, northern migration. So seeing whether that species is even going to survive in 10 years. And also looking at utilizing a GIS for the planting project to identify best areas in which to plant those seedlings that were delivered to ensure and increase seedling survival, utilizing a GIS system. Remember that there's no obligation for them to share with you that tribal Indigenous knowledge. Some of the Indigenous voices I want to raise that are in the Academy, and this is just a few, is Dr. Carletta Chief, who does a lot of work in Navajo. She is Navajo and does a lot of work with environmental and water quality issues related to the Gold King mine spill, uranium issues. She's also published a lot on climate change, also on how to work within Indigenous communities. So she wrote a guidebook paper. Again, as research students, you can look that up. Kyle Powell White is also one that I refer to a lot in the Academy, who does a lot of writing on Indigenous rights, climate change, and is now at University of Michigan. Michelle R. Montgomery, who kind of talks about identity and research as well. Dr. Lydia Jennings just graduated, I believe it was last year or year before. I'm thrilled with. She is Dene and she does soils. I mean, having an Indigenous soil scientist is really, it's fantastic. We're just celebrating that. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield, who is actually at Oregon State University, I believe, does a lot of writing as well. And Daniel R. Wildcat, of course, who is one of our leaders, as well as Merv Tano, who is Hawaiian, actually sort of are our leaders in a group that's called the Rising Voices. So if you get interested and want to join, you don't have to be Indigenous to join that, but essentially it is a group of Indigenous peoples who get together and have an annual meeting and try to form a policy white paper based on what's going on currently in Indian country. And so far, what we also kind of looked at and focused on was data sovereignty is very important in basically looking at, and one name I didn't bring up was actually Dr. Dominique David Chavez, who actually is a research scientist here and doing a postdoc at Colorado State University through the Native Nations Institute and through Colorado State. Essentially, her paper she wrote for her PhD work and finished in 2019 basically looked at all of the research that was done on reservations, and about 85% of that knowledge left the reservation and was never utilized to help advance anything or benefit the tribe whatsoever. So, that's an eye-opening paper and eye-opening research that she did for her PhD work. So now she's working with the Native Nations Institute with Dr. Stephanie Carroll Russo, who also does and runs that program in University of Arizona. She is actually working on looking at how we can empower data sovereignty with tribes. A lot of tribes aren't very good and not very set up very well to capture, and basically serve as gatekeepers. So a lot of tribal colleges are taking that on, and a lot of the THPO offices are also taking that on to make sure that anyone coming in to do research isn't going to talk to people on the reservation, do these surveys, come on and do this and leave and not have it benefit directly the community itself. So Indigenous involvement in environmental stewardship really has to be couched within social ecological issues. Some of the key lessons are importance of bridging organizations and social learning, an appropriate consensus-based decision-making, need for continual learning and adaptive management practices, frequent communication, building these long-term relationships. Stakeholders are really, they're not stakeholders, they're landholders. Remembering the settler colonial structures are still in place, and that you really should engage with tribes on a government-to-government basis as they are sovereign nations. One of the papers I just mentioned, or I just talked about, Kyle Powis-White, that I found very, very enlightening, and I think you will too, is these are factors that will support Indigenous involvement for a multi-actor environmental stewardship. It sort of gives you these key strategies. So I would highly recommend this paper, as well as one that was written by Sammy Chisholm Hatfield that he was also a co-author on Indigenous Time. Something you need to learn about is Indian time is not always thought of as late. It's determined based on seasons and on when is the best time for this to happen. So in this paper, it really looked at interviews and looking at Indigenous cultural representation, the context, the goal of the partnerships, and the reported outcomes. And as you can see, there are various advantageous focused subject matters that really these people felt were important in reaching the goals of partnerships. And that is obviously looking at the shared interest of environmental protection and education, and in particularly informed formal agreements prior to any implementation. So challenges in these collaborative problem solvings always recognize the differing worldviews within a management framework. That will help you to bring forward an Indigenous thought process and is really ingrained in any kind of equity and justice that you're talking about when working within tribal nations. These are broad ecological issues and they're not limited to geography. However, tribes have political authority only over so much. And they're also sort of bound by that tribal trust with the agent of Bureau of Indian Affairs that often causes problems anytime you want to do development on tribal lands. Formal legal binding agreements are really key to respect values and knowledge systems and really kind of balance that decision-making process. So just to sum up keys to successful tribal engagement: respecting their knowledges, understanding they have the control of knowledge mobilization. Should they choose to not share, then that's their right. There should be an intergenerational involvement. They are self-determined and cross-cultural education is key. And with that, I'd like to say aho and thank you from all of us at the Trees, Water, and People and our team.
Thank you, Dr. Small. We have a question from Amanda Phillips. I'll read it out loud for the group. She asks, Question regarding your earlier statement that your organization emphasizes long-term commitments to the communities you work with. What are some of the challenges, if any, that emerge when balancing this commitment and funding sources that may operate on limited timelines?
Right. So the reason that we build long-term commitments is because oftentimes restoration projects take longer than a year, and yet a lot of federal funding is 1 or 2 years. So the reason we do that long-term engagement process is because it often takes some time, 3 to 5 years, to make sure that we've been able to effectively restore these ecosystems. So, and oftentimes at landscape scales, it does take a longer term process. Now, that being said, we want to also make sure we're connecting them with ways in which that they can build sustainable economies, and also try to start, planting and basically growing their own species for their own restoration projects. So at the same time, we're trying to build their capacity to do it themselves, where they no longer need us. So I hope that helps, because we also don't want to be a bank account, because we oftentimes, nonprofits don't just rely on grant money. We also get money from foundations who believe in us and are with us long term, believe in our shared values, and believe in trying to help Indigenous nations build their local economies around their restoration projects, particularly given climate change, and improve their food sovereignty programs. So, that's given. We also want to make sure that they start building local economies and circular economies as we go through, so that at some point in time, they no longer need our help. So I hope that explains that. But yeah, we're constantly chasing some of that federal funds. But it doesn't mean that we get it from one source. We have several sources. We have a list of really wonderful donors who give to us every year. We have public campaigns that we go out to that help us, through crowd sharing funding, so that we can raise money that will go towards these projects as well. So we try to diversify our funding so that we don't rely just specifically on that 1 or 2 year funding that comes through from EPA or from, some of the other federal and state and local funding sources. So good question. Next.
We have another one from Amy. She says, "Thank you for raising the issue of data sovereignty. Could you suggest some best practices or checks for ensuring that research data have been ethically created or collected? I'm thinking of the end of the project, e.g. when it's time to publish papers and data."
Okay, well, I think the whole idea behind data sovereignty is to make sure that before you even start the research process, that you have already engaged and started building a relationship with the tribe, and you're aware of, and you're doing it in response to a need within the community. Then at that time is where you start discussing what is sacred, what is, knowledge that you can share publicly, and what can't you share, because those should be done up front before the research even starts. If you're going to be doing it on the back end, it's kind of coming in a little too late. But what you could do is basically reach out and discuss with those, and hopefully the research does some benefit, provide some benefit, and enlighten the community to help the community itself and benefit them in some way. It is tricky. I feel what you're saying about publishing. I had the same issue when I had to go to publish the case study that was published in the NCA4. And that was on the climate change modeling tool I utilized for the distribution of 10 years out from climate change variables and map of Russian olive. And so, however, it had been 10 years or longer since that data had already been given to the tribe, and they had already enacted on that. So that was how I was able to. And then I spoke with, of course, clan uncles and aunties and some of my family members. So if you're, I don't know if you're tribal or not, but if you aren't, then, I'm not sure what strategy you could use other than to reach out to some of their leaders and discuss with them what knowledge you have gained from the research you've conducted, and then talk with them about what they feel is they're comfortable with in having you publish. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I have a question, actually. This is Bella. So I was wondering, you talked a little bit about sort of like the rehabilitation of land after these really intense forest fires.
Right.
But I was thinking about, with all the recent large-scale wildfires in the Western US, I feel like there's been this growing public acknowledgement of the problems associated with the US Forest Service's legacy of fire suppression.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering if in the regions you work with and with the people you work with, do you know if there's been any engagement between federal or state agencies and Indigenous communities to try to bring back Indigenous-led management of forested landscapes in an attempt to bring back some sort of sense of quote unquote resiliency in these forests?
That's a great question. I think that it depends on what forest systems we're talking about, what region. I'm not so convinced that we do it here because we had huge fires here last year. It rained ash for 6 weeks with the Cameron Peak fire. And so, but I know in California, some tribes there are trying to work with the Forest Service to help them understand prescribed burning and how they do it and engage with them for best practices to inform their forest system. I don't know as a whole whether or not that will take place, but it's encouraging to know that at least in some regions, some of these Forest Service federal district managers are recognizing that these Indigenous knowledges on forest management and prescribed burning might be valuable. So it's a slow process. As you know, it's been a very uncomfortable and difficult past in dealing with federal agencies such as the Forest Service, particularly with native lands and trying to incorporate native voices and bring those into play when managing public lands. So it's a slow process, but I think we're making some headway, and it does depend on where we're at.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like trust probably is a huge part of that, or lack of trust.
It's a huge issue. Yeah.
And this is, I think, less of a question, but more of a comment. But Josh Ginsburg, in response to your response to Amy about data sovereignty, he says, "Great answer. I have found working with Indigenous groups overseas that ensuring data are lodged with the community and the community is trained or has existing skills to use these data is also critical, as it promotes exchange of ideas and processes and often reduces contention of what can and can't be published."
Exactly.
And we have a question from Ilya Fishoff. He asks, could you share more about what it looks like to build circular economies, or an example of that?
Yeah, that's something that we're just starting to do and work at from sort of a higher level. That's a good question. And the way that I perceive that in building circular economies is around food systems and agriculture. And I'll give you an example of that, is that within the Crow Reservation, we have, just under 3 million acres. And of that, less than, and the primary economy of Bighorn County, where Crow Reservation is located, is agriculture, millions. And, it would take a little bit to get into land policy decisions and land tenure issues. So I'll skip over that, but just to say that less than 3% is Indigenous owned and managed and run agricultural gains or operations. And of that 3%, less than 1% are farmers. The rest are all non-Indigenous people who were either leasing land or purchased land illegally in the 1920s, and are making millions and giving lease money to Indigenous owners for pennies on the dollar. So this is the legacy of the Dawes Act and an issue that is yet to be addressed. And it was made worse by AGPRA. I won't go into that, but essentially it has made a mess culturally to have us approach this. But I can say that, building it around food systems is key to one, reducing food insecurity, to building markets so that they can essentially use those food products to build markets, to ship, to share, and send out, to supply local restaurants with their, traditional foods. And so it's a slow process. I think the Intertribal Ag Council recently had a great talk about Indian country essentially working and trying to build these food system hubs regionally, so that Indigenous tribes then who are in bison, who have brought back bison, can then start shipping and utilizing an Indigenous trucking network to be able to start building these economies through our own drivers. And essentially trying to get into that is difficult because you have like Cargill, and all of these huge food conglomerates that basically push us out of competing within the market. But if we can build it within tribal communities, it might work, and at a smaller scale. So that's sort of what I'm talking about when building circular economies. Getting a greenhouse, growing maybe species that are wanted from a perspective of, people who want to do landscape and can't find certain species that are difficult to find that they want for landscaping, they can grow those, as well as growing foods that they can sell at markets, and or growing certain herbs, teas, and getting products put together that they can market themselves. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about building a circular economy, and it's based around food and agriculture.
Thank you for that clarification.
And that's why it's important to restore their natural resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. We have another question from Z. This is a follow-up to one of the previous questions. He asks, are there more opportunities to restore traditional land management practices on reservations versus treaty lands? Or are there similar bureaucratic challenges with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as with the U.S. Forest Service?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand. Could you read that first part?
Yeah, I'll unmute Z and ask him.
Yeah, could you clarify that?
Sure. Sorry about the lack of clarity there. I'm basically just,
No.
I'm just wondering if you, like you're noting these bureaucratic challenges, challenges with regards to federal agencies, and your question on the answer to the circular economy question kind of got at this. I'm just wondering if you see like different types of challenges working on reservation lands versus treaty lands to rebuild these food systems, or are there similar kind of hurdles that you have to deal with in terms of federal government agencies or limited jurisdiction there?
Okay, reservation lands and trust lands are one and the same?
I guess I meant off reservation.
Oh, okay. So what you're talking about are adjacent public lands to reservations. Yeah, it's a problem. And I can say that it's an issue because this is why I put the paper up that Kyle Powles-Wright wrote on multi-actor environmental, collaborative projects, is that, anytime they do something on public, federally managed lands, they need to consult with tribes. Unfortunately, that's not always done at the beginning of a project. And so, but I do see some of that changing. There are some bureaucratic issues relative to trust lands. Anytime that you do work on trust lands, you have to go through the process of getting NEPA performed to make sure that you're not disturbing any, ancestral sites or archaeological sites that might be valuable to them. And so that is a process, and it is just part of having to work within reservation lands, trust lands. And so, you have to account for that in any of the projects you do. What we try to do is really engage with those neighboring federal, lands, or even national park system lands, and try to engage with those agencies on behalf of the tribes to make sure that their priorities are taken into consideration at the beginning of the project. So it's not an easy process, and it's time consuming. And I think one of the reasons that we're also trying to build capacity within tribes is, a lot of these applications are really long, and you have to utilize certain, language in order to get funded. And a lot of tribes don't have that capacity, because I can say that tribal natural resource departments often aren't supported by their tribes funding. They have to get their own funding through EPA, GAP grants, EQIP, so, some of these problems are what we're trying to help resolve by getting funds to support natural resource people to actually be able to do their work on the ground, particularly monitoring and evaluating after these trees go into the ground. So we try to provide that seasonal employment. But the needs are great, and there's not always easy answers, and each tribe is different, how they're arranged through their arrangement or their agreement through the federal government. Some are 638, some are, treaty tribes. So again, it's really different. Remember, there are 574 tribes that are federally recognized, but there are also a lot of other state and unfederally recognized tribes who also have, needs. So we don't limit it to federally recognition, and try to help. Also, we're trying to do some local work here with some of the agencies on the Cameron Peak fire. So we try to work locally as well. It's not just U.S. tribal lands, but we try to make sure when we're working on U.S. federal public lands that we bring with us the tribal perspective and vision and their knowledge base as we engage with them. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And then we are just about out of time, but a few people have asked if you could say the name of the paper you're referencing again. I think you went pretty quickly on the slide.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, if you could just hold a second. Oh, there it is. I can put that up. It was published in Alternative 2017, volume 13, issue 2, page 58 to 68, and it was published in 2017.
Great.
The initial author is Nicholas J. Rail, but Kyle Powis-White is the second author on this paper.
Thank you.
Also, I want to make sure that you have Dominique David, D-A-V-I-D dash Chavez, C-H-A-V-E-Z, here at Colorado State, working through the Native Nations Institute out of University of Arizona, that you, if you want, get access to her PhD work.
Thank you.
I hope that helps. Did everybody get a chance to get this? And, all of these other authors, there's a lot of other people that I look at too, Desi Rodriguez, Lone Bear, Marcia Small, who will soon be a PhD, who is actually a relative, other people with nonprofits, Jackie Old Coyote, running the Potlatch, the Potlatch Fund, I think. No, Potlatch is run by my other sister-in-law, who is Cleora Scott Hill, or Cleora Hill Scott, I should say. And then Jackie Old Coyote runs, there's one out east, because she's in New York. She's actually from Crow. Anyway, that nonprofit escapes me, but, Sierra Green working out of, the Northwest Indian College out of Washington State. Nikki Cooley, who works for ITEP, which stands for Indigenous Tribal Environmental Professionals. Always make sure you check in with them. ITEP runs a lot of stuff. Rising Voices, as I mentioned before, might be a good place for you all to want to network and, join and become involved. We have an Indigenous Phonology network that has been formed and holds monthly meetings to get an Indigenous sort of, Indigenous network together to recognize seasonal changes in phonology. And report those back, but I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I went so fast through that. Yeah.
No worries. Thank you so much again for the seminar. I think we learned a lot and you provided so many great resources. And
Sure.
yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's been an honor. And I think I'm going to be here for the group discussion.
Yes. I'll send you a link for all of that.
That will start at 11 my time.
Yes.
Okay. So I will see everyone at 11.